Hey everyone, and welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're digging into a really fascinating investigation that uncovers a quiet power struggle right at the heart of Bitcoin. It's a story about how, even in a project that's supposed to be totally decentralized, informal influence can end up shaping everything.
Okay, so let's start with the central mystery that kicks this whole thing off. It's a question that really gets to the core of trust in the entire Bitcoin ecosystem, and it's this. What on earth could possibly cause thousands and thousands of users to just up and leave the main software, like overnight?
The story really begins right here. Back in the fall of 2025, the network saw this just huge, totally unexpected shift. You had thousands of people running the standard Bitcoin Core software suddenly switch to this alternative called Bitcoin Knots. And look, this wasn't some kind of bug or a glitch. Nope, it was a deliberate move, a protest, really, all playing out in real time.
So, what was the trigger? Well, this investigation traces that massive user revolt back to one single decision, a specific code change merged by a Bitcoin Core maintainer named Gloria Zhao. See, the change made it easier to store non-financial data on the blockchain, and this just ignited this massive debate about what Bitcoin is even for. Is it supposed to be this pure monetary network, or is it something else?
Okay, so that raises the real question, right? How did this one developer get into a position to make such a huge call? I mean, Bitcoin doesn't have a CEO, there's no formal hierarchy, so how does it end up being guided by what the source article describes as a small, tight-knit group? To figure that out, we've got to rewind a few years. The investigation really zooms in on a developer named John Newberry. By 2020, he had his hands in all these key organizations that basically formed the backbone of Bitcoin development. He was at the center of this web, connecting technical education, developer training, and, crucially, funding. And this slide really lays out the system the article documents. You've got OpTech for education and networking, then there's Chaincode Labs, which became the main pipeline for recruiting new developers, and finally Brink, which was set up to fund those very developers. It's this neat, interconnected structure, and the investigation points out that you often see the same key people and the same funders involved across all three. Another name that comes up is Adam Jonas. He was hired by Newberry to help run the programs at Chaincode. Now, Jonas's background is interesting. He came from a place called the Flatiron School, which makes diversity and inclusion a really explicit part of its mission. And he brought that whole approach to building educational programs right into the heart of the Bitcoin dev pipeline.
All right, so let's get into the mechanics of it. How did this recruitment network actually operate on the ground? Well, the source material gives us two really detailed case studies that kind of show the pattern of how people were brought in and promoted. So first up is Amity Uttarwar. If you look at her career path, which is all documented publicly, you see this really clear pattern. She applies to the Chaincode program and gets rejected. Then she meets John Newberry at a social dinner. Soon after that, she reapplies to the same program, the one he helps run, and this time she's in. And not long after that, she gets funding that was arranged by him and Adam Jonas. And this isn't just an outsider's take. Uttarwar herself said that meeting Newberry was a pivotal night for her career. She gives him credit for creating the opportunity for her and for giving her that crucial guidance that she needed to get into Bitcoin Core development. But then you look at Gloria Zhao's story, and it's even more accelerated. I mean, we're talking about going from a student who was completely over blockchain to being personally recruited, mentored, and then in less than a year, announced as the very first fellow for Brink, the new funding organization co-founded by her mentor, John Newberry. It's a whirlwind. And just to be clear, according to her own interviews, Zhao wasn't just on the fence. She was actively not interested in Bitcoin. When Adam Jonas from Chaincode first emailed her, she was literally about to wipe blockchain off her resume and go get a job at a big tech company like Google or Facebook. But the big turning point was a meeting at Stanford that Jonas set up. She sat down with Newberry and Amity Uttarwar, who was sort of the class ahead of her in this pipeline. Zha calls it a very fateful day. Just a 3-hour conversation that completely flipped her perspective and put her on the path to becoming one of the most powerful developers in the space. Now, this is where it gets really interesting. The article puts these stories side by side with the experience of another developer, John Atack. So at the exact same time Zhao was being recruited despite having no contribution history and no interest, Atack, a guy who would go on to be one of the top 5 most prolific contributors in the world, was getting rejected by this same pipeline. And it took him more than a year of unpaid work just to get a grant. The contrast is pretty stark. So you're probably wondering, how did a network like this operate so openly without getting a ton of pushback?
Well, the investigation points to a really specific set of tactics, both rhetorical and structural, that basically insulated them from criticism.
One of the key tools seems to have been language. On a hugely popular podcast, for instance, Amarty Uttarwar described people who disagreed with a technical change as extractive. It was a way of painting critics not as legitimate participants in a debate, but as this loud, angry, illegitimate mob.
And get this, that word, extractive, it wasn't just pulled out of thin air. The source article shows it comes directly from a specific book about open source culture, a book that key members of this network, including Newbery, had read and even discussed with the author. So it seems like it was part of a shared strategic vocabulary. And this verbal defense was backed up by a ton of glowing media coverage. Article after article framed what the network was doing as a big win for diversity and inclusion. And the effect of that is that it makes any criticism, even purely technical criticism, really politically risky. It could easily be spun as an attack on progress itself. Okay, so let's bring this all back home. Let's talk about the alleged consequences of this network's influence. What was the actual cost of having this kind of pipeline-driven approach to Bitcoin development? While the article holds up John Attack as Exhibit A, he was literally told he wasn't long-term contributor material by the same people who were fast-tracking others. And then he went on to become one of the most productive developers on the planet, all on his own dime. It really suggests that the pipeline's filters were selecting for something besides just raw technical talent or commitment. The investigation also alleges that if you crossed someone inside this network, the fallout could be pretty severe. After he had a public technical disagreement with Newbery, Attack says he was basically blacklisted. He calls it a permanent doghouse status, where support just evaporated. Not just for him, but for anyone who was even seen as friendly to him. And that, right there, brings us full circle. The network was, in a way, incredibly successful. It achieved its goal. It got its chosen recruits into key positions of power. But the argument here is that this success had a huge price. The very developer who came up through this pipeline, Gloria Zhao, was the one who made the technical call that ended up alienating a fifth of the network and triggering that massive user revolt we saw at the very beginning. Now, to be clear, the investigation never questions the technical skills of anyone involved, but it leaves us with this really critical and kind of provocative question. It suggests that while Bitcoin's code itself might be decentralized, the human, social layer where development actually happens, well, that might be vulnerable to the same old power dynamics and centralization that we see everywhere else. And that's a big thing for the entire community to think about.